What's your favorite scary movie?
Wait, that isn't really the right genre. Hold on. Whew. That's better. Vaguely. But happy Halloween, everyone. When it comes to Halloween, there's almost nothing I love better, besides maybe Scream and Scooby-Doo, than Gothic horror. I know I've talked about Gothic horror a lot on this channel before with my Midnight Mass video, but it's honestly one of my favorite things to go to, both from a film standpoint and a literary one. It's technically the literary genre I've studied the most, and it just fascinates me with its deep, rich history, interesting themes, and that makes it so much more than just your traditional horror experience. So that's why this Halloween, I wanted to talk about what I think is one of the most slept on Gothic horrors I have seen. And that, of course, is Guillermo del Toro's 9th film, Crimson Peak. But soon, he cried with sad and solemn enthusiasm, I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace. Or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell. He sprang from the cabin window as he said this, upon the ice raft which lay close to the vessel. He was soon borne away by the waves, and lost in darkness and distance. What's up with that last chapter of Frankenstein, am I right? Anyway, let's talk about Crimson Peak. And to talk about Crimson Peak like I want to, we first have to understand a few things, mainly where it comes from. As previously stated, this is the 9th feature film from Academy Award winning and one of my personal favorite directors, Guillermo del Toro. And at the time of the film's original conception, it seemed like he had just gotten his big mainstream break with the commercial success of Hellboy and the reception of critical darling fairy tale horror film Pan's Labyrinth. These films encompassed so much of his past work, Pan's Labyrinth being the last film in a thematic trilogy starting with his very first feature film, Kronos. The future for the director was bright as he got to work on the far bigger budget sequel to Hellboy, and as he got signed on to do 2 films that would prequel one of the biggest movie trilogies of all time, The Hobbit. He was constantly having new ideas for scripts and adaptations that he would write down as he poured his time into these 2 massive projects. Hellboy 2: The Golden Army would release with yet again great commercial success, being his biggest hit to that point. But as the years went on in production for the Hobbit films, and I do mean years, the executives were looking at the budget grow and kept having creative differences with Del Toro, as before the project even started in earnest, it seemed to just go on, and Del Toro ended up stepping away from the project, where most of his work was scrapped, even though, in my opinion, he was the perfect director for those movies. And instead we got tired, doesn't want to be here Peter Jackson returning for one of the worst follow-up trilogies to a beloved trilogy out there that he actively said he was phoning it in for.
What that all eventuated in was a very short length of time, just a matter of a couple of months before we started shooting.
Which is impossible. And as a result of it being impossible, I just started shooting the movie with most of it not prepped at all.
But after his brush with such a massive, big studio project went poorly, Del Toro went out to try and get his next ideas picked up, including an adaptation of At the Mountain of Madness, which I so wish we could get someday, and he even tried shopping some of these scripts to other directors as he returned to the big screen with Pacific Rim, passing even the success of Hellboy 2, giving him the means to return to his other script ideas after no directors really wanted to pick them up. And ultimately, what studios jumped for was something a little different than most of the direct adaptations he pitched. A script he wrote with fellow writer and director Matthew Robbins, harkening back to one of my favorite time periods and genres of literature, Victorian Gothic. They wanted the script to be extremely reminiscent of very classic horror that they fell in love with of the 60s and 70s, having kind of grown tired of a lot of the very found footage, low-budget gore fests of the 2000s and 2010s. He wanted, as he would describe it for an interview for Deadline in 2012, to make a true haunted house movie, like a lot of the greats in the past, like The Shining and The Exorcist, but that would also have far older literary roots. And so, Crimson Peak was picked up and released in 2015. But that's not quite all the history I want to delve into, because sure, that tells us in a very brief form where the film comes from in terms of production following Del Toro's career. What I want to talk about is some of the deep history of the film's text itself, and why it is, in my opinion, the perfect modern take on Gothic literature, harkening back to all of the tropes in the best way and continuing it on for modern audiences in a really unique way, both as a narrative framework and thematic work of art. It may not be perfect, it may not be Guillermo del Toro's best work by far, but I think it's something worth talking about and worth remembering. So that's what I want to do this Halloween. Now, I've talked about the history of Gothic literature before. You don't need me to tell you again how it's largely considered to have originated as an aesthetic and motif in the late 18th century with the work of Horace Walpole, who wrote the first book to actually use the term Gothic in the way we think about it. How many of its visual and mythological tropes come from the oppressive force of the Catholic Church and a lack of understanding of modern medicine. How many of its ideas would be refined throughout the Victorian era, as the style of that era would be permanently associated with the word Gothic. Again, I've talked about all of that in length with my Midnight Mass video. What I more want to touch on in this video is the tropes and legacy that the fiction itself started and let live on. Because what makes Crimson Peak so special to me is the way it captures the spirit of late 19th century Gothic romance in such a modern way to give it a last hurrah to its legacy and maybe start a new chapter for Del Toro's career. You see, beyond the simple tropes first established of dark settings, anti-religious establishment themes, spooky monsters, Gothic architecture, and more, as the genre started to become a mainstay in literature, subgenres were born from it, and almost none would be more prevalent and important than the Gothic romance. Gothic romance as a subgenre is thought to have been originated with Anne Radcliffe's A Sicilian Romance, which released in 1790. And this was notable for several reasons, first of which is that it was written by a woman. The 1700s and of course previous times were very, very interesting for women interested in becoming authors. There were few paths one could take, and men at the time would pretty much only publish women's stories if they were quote-unquote made for women, or had some form of tropes associated by society with women. Mainly they needed to be a romance. You can sense a lot of frustration from female authors at the time in their writings, even from the ones who actually worked within this structure they were given, especially within a lot of the writings of the very prominent female author of the time, Jane Austen. You may have heard of her. And it would be this way for decades and decades more. You can even trace this frustration and direct look at the unfortunate guidelines put on women authors in one of my personal favorite books, Little Women, which was published in the mid to late 1800s. So a lot of female writers were very much put into boxes, and the ones who wished not to be put into these boxes would have to write under pseudonyms and go to great lengths to publish their works anonymously to get them treated with any respect or even published at all. A Sicilian Romance would similarly be published anonymously, being the second book from then 25-year-old Anne, and the author credit would simply be by the authoress of A Sicilian Romance. It was a powerful sentiment, and it, as well as several others of her books, took off. So much so that her husband actually quit his job and they were able to travel, giving her even more inspiration for her work. She was honestly one of the most influential writers at the time, and that same Jane Austen said in 1817, "I have read all of Miss Radcliffe's work, and most of them with great pleasure. The Mysteries of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay down again. I remember finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time. And it is within Anne Radcliffe's text, this hugely influential figure in literature that I rarely ever hear about, that we can find so many of the most prominent and important tropes of Gothic romance. Mainly the twisted veil of oppressed eroticism, something again chiefly not allowed in many stories at the time, especially from women, and from this religious oppression of women's sexuality and the ability to exist with it or away from it, created so much of what we now know of the tropes and themes of the sensual monster. I wonder if Del Toro would make a sensual monster movie at some point after this. And along with the fascination it brought to readers at the time, portraying sexual themes combined with the horror of Gothic fiction, this was also kind of the birth of the female horror protagonist. A champion of the female readership at the time that allowed so many complex themes and societal questions to be asked that couldn't previously. They are able to touch on the oppression of women, both from the religious establishments at the time, but also from male predatory forces personified in ultimate evil that they had to face all the time. Ghost stories allowed these female characters to move past the quote-unquote need for romance and the trappings of domestic life, and excitedly follow mysteries and killers and escape vampires and creatures of the night, and lead this charge into a trope that would still go strong in horror movies today. This introduction of the female protagonist and the story of Gothic and horror nature, and its importance in literature and art as we know it, cannot be understated. It would become practically the status quo, as so much of Gothic literature to come would be headed up by both men and women authors like Mary Shelley, Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, and the Gothic novel and Gothic romance especially conformed itself to allow its female audience to, quote, turn to Gothic romances to find support for their own mixed feelings. And it is through this idea of respite that not just Gothic romance began to thrive throughout history, but other genres inspired by them as well. As the years would go on, even the classic romance novel would start to more strongly lead on the ideas of questioning the female perspective and position in life. Horror as we know it would practically be defined by using its themes of violence, often still revolving around female protagonists and quote-unquote final girls, to explore and question things about our society and religion and relationship dynamics and sex. And even tropes popularized by Anne, like the haunted, almost living house, would go on to be a staple of horror fiction and films. It's grown so far beyond the trappings of its own subgenre, and probably honestly changed the course of art and history for the better. It makes it a fascinating genre to come back to after it's more or less died out in a modern context. Even the books authored by men at the time, such as one of my favorite books, Dracula, you can grab such interesting themes on sexual predators and a lot of the female experience when it came to that in religion. But despite my love for the genre itself, as I mentioned, it's mostly faded in a modern sense. There still certainly are examples of films, and especially books, that have come out under this Gothic romance umbrella, but despite that, especially from a cinematic angle, they are few and far between, and when they do come out, they are often forgotten or not heard of at all in the first place, despite all they've done for art on the whole and the countless people they've inspired and continue to inspire. Which is why, in the late 2000s and early 2010s landscape of horror, writers Guillermo del Toro and Matthew Robbins, tired of the films in that genre at the time, wanted to get back to the true roots of horror that they loved, deciding to chase them all the way back to their most popular and prevalent time of existence, to create one of the only true original Gothic romances I've seen in a while. We want no proofs, we ask none to believe us. This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare much for her sake. Jonathan Harker. Crimson Peak follows the character of Edith Cushing, an aspiring author of ghost stories and daughter of wealthy American businessman in the late 19th century. Her fascination with ghosts in this goldenly tangible feeling movie comes from the fact that her mother died when she was just 10 years old, and her ghost came back to visit her one night, warning her of things she did not yet understand. This is actually a really interesting and common trope, and specifically Gothic literature and Gothic romance. You would often have ghosts and monsters, but they would often not be the true monsters of the story, and often, despite scaring the protagonists, would be a source of help and guidance, leading them away from the wrong path. Her and her father are then visited by the Sharp siblings, Thomas and Lucille, as Thomas tries to pitch a mining machine for clay to Edith's father and business associates, whom of course don't trust him, as Thomas is woefully out of place and immediately stands out with his pale skin, black garbs, and kind of soft, sickly look. There are actually a lot of really cool videos on the clothing and costuming in this movie and the way that they specifically tell a narrative. I bring this up because, of course, the costuming is one of the big things that makes Thomas and Lucille stand out immediately. I would suggest checking out this one by Kaz Rowe. It'll be linked down in the description. It's genuinely a really cool movie because the costuming is honestly one of the best parts about this entire movie. They went insanely hard on the Victorian storytelling through specifically costuming, so shout out to that. But we get lots of playful romantic tension between Edith and Thomas, as Thomas waits for an answer from her father on funding for his project despite his mistrust, and Edith takes a liking to the Sharps, as they seem to shy away from the society she feels so out of place and trapped by. There's a really great scene towards the beginning at a picnic where Lucille is talking to Edith about where she comes from. We get a direct moth and butterfly theme set up, which, darn it, I need to stop making videos about art that has moth themes and metaphors. It's getting a bit ridiculous. But it sets up the immediate theme of darkness feasting on beauty in a very disturbing and ham-fisted way, and I think this scene is especially notable beyond just the setup of the themes that will very clearly track, with Edith being shown as a soft butterfly and Lucille being shown as a hard black moth, but rather I think it's notable for the way it sets up its themes, which, as I mentioned, is big, apparent, and in your face. One of the big things I've seen complained about with this movie is that it's pretty predictable, save for the one twist, which I'll get into later, which actually, surprisingly enough, one of the other big complaints that I read about for this movie was that there was no graphic Tom Hiddleston nudity, so maybe I shouldn't take these complaints as seriously. But this is immediately present in the film. The moment the Sharps come in, you know that something is off about them, and even if you're paying a little more attention, you may catch the comparison between Edith's mother's ghost saying, "Beware Crimson Peak," and the fact that Thomas's machine that he is building is made to mine red clay. And then, especially with this scene during the picnic, you feel that the movie is actively screaming at you that she should not trust these people. When her father then violently and mysteriously dies later, once he investigates the Sharps and finds out some mysterious information about them, and we see that it's done by someone wearing black clothes and with black hair, and we've only seen 2 people that match that description who now have clear motivations literally right before it happens, you obviously know that they're the bad guys of the film. So save for one twist, what is the narrative drive here? Some people may be asking. Well, in my opinion, it's, of course, if Edith will make it out okay, and what fully is going on between the Sharps and the mystery behind them, and what does this actually mean for Edith as a person. Edith starts out, despite having wants and needs, kind of as a blank slate. She does not have very many life experiences. She is this clothed in white, quote-unquote pure character with not much experience in things other than a ghost story with her mom and a clear fascination for things that she's not allowed to engage with in society. It then becomes this fascinating tragedy filled with dread as you see a woman with such a kind heart and passion for writing being taken on this ghost story of her own, with frightening but helpful ghosts, strange sicknesses, and an almost living house, as Edith discovers the true horrors awaiting for her in the illustrious halls she will soon call home as she marries Thomas after the mysterious death of her father and returns back with him to England. I'll stop here to make another point that, continuing with Del Toro's work and the legacy he's created, this movie is beautiful, and might just be his most overtly beautiful in my opinion, while also having some of his most disturbing imagery to boot with these ghost designs. It yet again goes out of its way to capture this sense of immense, tangible beauty being sucked up, eaten away, literally sinking into the red clay in the ground, and being destroyed by those who would kill for money or for love. Again, the house itself of Allerdale Manor sinking into its bloody roots and cursed halls. No matter their attempts at upkeep, the costuming, the lighting, the set design makes this almost suffocating as you literally see our main character get overwhelmed in the immense landscape of her new home, and even in the puffiness of her nightgown that engulfs her figure as the story goes on. It's poetic and again very much in your face, and the crimson ghosts that haunt its halls are honestly some of the most striking and best designed work I've seen from Del Toro, hands down, which is really, really a big shout out, because one of the things that Del Toro, in my opinion, has always been good at, honestly the best at, is creating practical monsters. He has some of the best you will ever see. Each time you see them, despite their calls for help for Edith, you cannot help but be terrified. But eventually, as things start to get worse and worse and unwind in Allerdale Manor, eventually the truth does come out. Edith finds, with the help of the ghosts, that the Sharp children had been marrying and murdering people over and over for money to build the machine that Thomas believes will restore their status and wealth to their home. The ghosts of Crimson Peak, which she finds is the nickname for Allerdale Manor, after seeing that when it snows, the red clay underneath stains all of the snow red, are their ghosts, killed in increasingly brutal ways, starting with Lucille's very own mother, bathed in crimson to remind you of the substance and the stupid reason it was all for. Which is where we find another major complaint of the movie. It comes from the actual motive of the Sharp siblings, which very, very, very much show spoilers. I think the twists and turns of this story are incredible to experience for the first time with no knowledge, so if you haven't watched the movie yet, please do yourself a favor, pause the video, watch the movie, I think it's on Netflix, and then come right back. You see, the motivations of our characters aren't just wrapped up in money and clay. This is just a vehicle for Lucille, the true villain of the story, to control Thomas with. It is revealed as Edith is suffering from the poison Lucille has been giving her, and the revelation from the ghosts about what happened, that Thomas and Lucille's twisted relationship goes one step further, as she walks in on them getting handsy, and Thomas's face is filled with shame, seeing Edith, who he's grown to love, a true love he's never known, and Lucille's face is filled with delight, as she finally is able to lord over Edith the true control and power she feels she has over all of them, now looking at Edith straight in the eye. It's a really powerful moment in the movie. I may not play footage from that scene for, I think, obvious reasons, but it's this real big turning point. Crimson Peak truly sinks into the hell for Edith that it was always told to be. This building, alive with ghosts and demons, holding to the past beauties, now corrupted, as Lucille and Crimson Peak finally show their true form. But the complaint is usually that it doesn't make full narrative sense as it all comes around. But I would argue that these kind of light-feeling motivations, because, like, why did they need to fix Thomas's machine? That's kind of the motivation for the actual plot getting to go forward, is fixing Thomas's machine to where they can get their fortune back. But that doesn't fully tie into the fact that Lucille doesn't seem to really care, but that's kind of the point. Lucille doesn't especially care if Thomas can mine clay and they can make money from that again. She cares about finding something that she can use to hold power over Thomas. And in this specific way, getting money for the machine is how she convinces Thomas that it's all worth it. The same way, the abuse that their mother and father gave them allowed Lucille to convince Thomas that brutally murdering their mother was all worth it. On top of that, I've seen some complaints about the fact that it has, like, incest itself in it, which, I mean, I guess I can understand that as a complaint. If you don't want to see that in your movie, I could totally see just, like, not going for what this movie is. But fun fact, incest itself is yet again another one of those strong Gothic tropes we're going to. In fact, incest is such a big part of kind of what is known of Gothic literature because of vampires and kind of the bloodlines of places like Romania and Transylvania and the way that they were quote-unquote protected for all of those old counts and countesses. And, you know, they protected it by keeping it in the family, which is actually specifically why vampires have such exaggerated features, because one of the things of incest genetics is that it highlights specific features and can mutate and exaggerate them over time. But anyway, I'm digging way too deep here. You guys don't need to know all that. It's not very relevant. But it does continue this theme of connecting very strongly to very old Gothic literature. Weird tropes and all. I think ultimately, though, the way I see this plot going out, and this will maybe be a little bit of a stretch, is akin to something like Paul Thomas Anderson's later work, like Phantom Thread, where the focus is less on action, but the reaction of the characters and the way those actions change the dynamics. Watching this movie a second, third, fourth time drastically changes how you see these dynamics and actions and how the entire movie ends up feeling. Each thing feels less like, oh, okay, they did this, obviously that's a bad thing, and more like a specific targeted power move, not just between Edith and Thomas and Lucille as the Sharp siblings, but specifically between the two Sharp siblings. I think there's some really fascinating character drama between Thomas, Edith, and Lucille all as separate characters, and the way that Lucille ultimately ends up killing Thomas for falling in love with Edith really hits in with the kind of divine, inevitable sense of tragedy that comes with stories like this. But I think what really ties together this kind of interestingly crafted narrative that relies so much on the Gothic tropes themselves and less on full plot is that opening shot where we see that Crimson Peak's title card is a book. I think that is really the most important, is that this was put together as a book, and it makes all of these in-your-face themes work so well. Like I said in the beginning, Edith is an aspiring author, stating plainly in the text of the film that she wishes she could be like Mary Shelley. That's not technically the context of it, but they wouldn't bring that up for no reason. Edith obviously idolizes Mary Shelley in the story. And we see already by the beginning of our story, which again starts at the end, the opening shot of our story is also the final shot of our story. Edith telling us outside of the story that ghosts are real, and explaining to us in a book that she wrote as to why. We see her entire novel come together in a very meta way, similar to something like the new adaptation of Little Women, one of my all-time favorites, if not my favorite movie ever, where the text of the book is also acknowledging the writing of the text of the book, and it allows for these really cool moments where you can see the author's voice come into the way that the story was portrayed as she grows. As we see her become this author she always wanted to be, and she did it by specifically turning the whole nightmare that she lived through into her story, into her idea to take these dying halls of crimson, of stories and beauties of old, and the hardships and the decay that they had been through, and that you have been through yourself in life, and turn those into the next generation of art, the inspiration for her own work. I brought a lot of attention to Anne Radcliffe and female authors of Gothic romance earlier, and there was a reason for that. Because when I read their stories, both in real life and their fiction, the tragic fact of the deaths of the early era they were living in. I mean, Anne Radcliffe died in her 50s, due to something as simple as a lung infection, never able to fully finish her later work of poetry. And yet her influence lives through hundreds of years of fiction. Her story told again and again, even if we've lost her name along with it. And that's what Gothic romance and Gothic literature is all about. Capturing our ghosts, our memories, our regrets, our tragedies, and reforming them into spooky characters that can be overcome, into art that can inspire and change things in our world, even if they're over-exaggerated, that can help others for generations to come, that can entertain and inspire them. And what I think Crimson Peak does, in its cool, interesting, modern, metatextual, way more violent than this genre used to be, nails the themes right on the head. Through the actual text, with Edith quite literally turning her ghosts and the ghosts of those before her into art. And also with Del Toro's career himself, taking the ghost stories of the world he grew up on to revitalize a ghost of a genre that would lay the groundwork for future work and projects that would shock everyone with critical reception and beauty and strangeness and appeal to mass audiences. Crimson Peak flourishes its themes in an almost slow burn story to give a hopeful and exciting retelling of this same book that we all know and that we've been sharing and retelling and reforming for over 300 years. For the story of an everyday artist with all the odds stacked against her, overcoming pain and making something truly beautiful. Maybe I'm over-romanticizing this simple little movie, stretching its text. Maybe you just weren't super into the structure of the movie or the incest reveal or the note it ends on. And honestly, that's fair. It's not my favorite, nor is it nearly the best work from Del Toro. But I think it's really interesting to look at and important to talk about. It was trying to do something important, especially for the time in movies that it came out. And there are so many beautiful complexities to love and enjoy in the movie, as well as just being a pleasant and simple and light story that I can turn on during spooky season. And it's super sad to me that this movie flopped the way it did. I mean, it was marketed horribly. It was essentially marketed as a horror movie because that was the only audience it had. It's not really a horror movie. All they ever showed were the scenes of these really terrifying ghosts, and then what people got was just like a romance drama that's spooky and occasionally has some ghosts. So, I totally understand why so many people were turned off to this at the time, but I think it's honestly an important story to romanticize. If we're not to romanticize Gothic literature and film, I don't know what else we should romanticize. It's beautiful and scary, and is such an amazing narrative stepping stone with incredible imagery and history, and the ability to tell beautiful tragic stories of overcoming odds and powerful women. And to me, there's pretty much nothing better than that. So yeah, thank you guys for watching and putting up with my craziness and my hair, which desperately needs a haircut right now. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video and have had a great spooky season. Happy Halloween, everyone. This time I had just done 2 freaking long videos back to back. I wanted to do something a little bit shorter and just wax poetically about a movie that I think is neat. Not even perfect, not the best, just neat. And, you know, hopefully that was interesting. The moral of the story should be that you guys should check out some Gothic fiction. Maybe Dracula. Maybe even Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's a great movie. Crimson Peak, perhaps, if that's your thing. All I'm saying is you guys should check out some more from this really, really interesting genre. Maybe Midnight Mass, like I suggested a couple years ago, or maybe even some of the work of Anne Radcliffe's, or Mary Shelley, or some of the other authors I've mentioned. I love Gothic literature. I love Gothic romance. It's the best. I think it's super cool. And I loved hanging out with you guys. This month was my birthday. That's cool. I got this tattoo. If you can see that. That was cool. So yeah, it's been a crazy busy month and life is getting very interesting. I don't know how much more I'll be able to do this kind of studio setting. I might be leaving the country soon, which is pretty crazy, and my setup will then drastically change and my frequency of videos will probably have to change. So we'll see how this channel goes. In the meantime, thank you guys all so much for your support, for your love on my videos, even some of my more obscure ones. I can't believe my new short film experiment thing that I did. It's not really like an original film technically. It was a film experiment I did to take old archive and internet archive footage that was in the public domain and music that was in the public domain and create kind of a narrative experience out of that, just kind of as a fun thing for me to do. But it's gotten a ton of views, way more so than any of my short films normally do, so thanks for that. I hope you guys enjoy it, but I'll catch you guys next month. I don't know what I'm gonna do a video on, but I'm sure you guys will vote on it on Twitter, which the link will be down there. I put a poll up. I usually put a poll up on YouTube too, so you guys can always vote on what video we might or might not get. I love you all, enjoy Halloween, and Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Alright, it's rolling. I'm gonna do an audio reference. Whenever you're ready. What's your favorite scary movie? You know, that's not really the right genre. Hold on. Don't worry, you got completely out of the frame before you bobbed back up. It was fine. And start it. How the kind of framing was. I think it looks good. Maybe a little more that direction. Yeah, that's perfect. All right. Take 2. Whenever you're ready. What's your favorite scary movie? You're gonna say the line. You know, this isn't the right genre. Oh my goodness.